On May 12, 1945, near a makeshift detention center in Bad Kreuznach, Germany, the gates clanged shut behind a line of women cloaked in tattered Wehrmacht uniforms. Rain clung to the barbed wire fences, turning the soil beneath their boots to grey paste. These were German female prisoners of war, eyes sallow with fatigue, jaws locked with defiance. The war had ended just days before, but for these women, captives of the enemy they had been conditioned to despise, the war breathed on in humiliation, uncertainty, and fear. The Americans, looming tall in strange brown uniforms and sharper silence, offered something unexpected that morning. Metal trays steaming with food, mashed potatoes, meatloaf, collard greens. The women sneered. They nudged one another and laughed. It looked like pig slop. One of them, a lieutenant nurse no older than 25, whispered sharply, "This is what they feed their soldiers." Their hunger clawed at their ribs, but they turned their backs on the trays. For now. By noon, their defiance had begun to fracture. The rain eased into a dull drizzle, and the camp's bleak murk blended with the acrid smell of wet wool and boiled meat. Hunger changed the air. Jokes stopped. One girl, Marta, once a Red Cross volunteer in Bremen, stared long enough at the tray to see steam still curling from the edges of the gravy. Her stomach growled audibly. Across the mud path, two guards exchanged a quiet glance but said nothing. Slowly, Marta stepped forward alone. Her boots squelched. No orders were given, no permission asked. She picked up the tray, her hand trembling slightly. The other women stared. Tension thickened. Behind her, one muttered something about weakness. But Marta sat on a low wooden bench, lifted the fork, and took a bite. She paused, her brow furrowed. Then she looked up, stunned not by revulsion, but by the warmth that melted over her tongue. For the first time that day, silence deepened into shock. The shift was invisible but seismic. Marta didn't speak, but her second bite was faster. A third followed without hesitation. The others watched like statues. Then one more stepped forward, a tall woman with a stitched sleeve and bloodshot eyes. Irma, once a freight clerk turned communications assistant along the Eastern Front. She reached for a tray. Then another followed. The line reformed, slower this time, stripped of mockery. Even the guards seemed to breathe differently. The food's heat cut through the damp, and its scent no longer seemed foreign, it was human. As the women ate, some in silence, others in quiet murmurs, something changed in their posture. Shoulders eased, forks scraped clean. A soldier leaned against the fence post, watching. "They were starving," he said under his breath. But it wasn't just hunger. In those metal trays, steaming against the washed-out sky, there was something else, unexpected dignity, and that was harder to swallow. By the second day, the trays arrived to less resistance. The women lined up without being called. Their hands still shook, not from fear, but from weeks of deprivation. Irma, her features hollowed by war, took her tray with a strange reverence, tracing the metal edge before moving aside to eat. Nadine, a former code operator with a braid undone by the rain, whispered to the woman next to her, "It doesn't taste like victory, but it doesn't taste like defeat either." That night, one of the guards smuggled a small clump of sugar cubes, leaving them on a bench near the latrine, a quiet offering. No one knew who took them, but by morning they were gone. The Americans never said much. They didn't ask questions, didn't gloat. The silence between captor and captive wasn't warm, but it was no longer cold. There, in a camp sewn together with barbed wire and hunger, something strange took root, restraint, then recognition, and in fleeting moments, something like grace. But grace was fragile, and silence rarely told the full tale. On the third morning, a convoy pulled in through the eastern gate, sloshing over puddles that mirrored the wan October sky. An officer stepped down, his coat too clean, his boots too polished. With him came a crate, stamped in bold black, "Rations, U.S. Army." The prisoners stood still, confused. Then the officer barked, not in English, not even in sharp German, but in halting, awkward phrases, asking for volunteers from among the women who had nursing experience. A pause stretched. Marta stepped forward again, joined hesitantly by two others. The guards said nothing as the women were led past the wire into a field tent. Inside, wounded American soldiers lay on cots, eyes bandaged, legs splinted. The air was warm with antiseptic and fear. And it was there, knee-deep in pain on both sides, that the deepest irony bloomed. The enemy's hands now cleaned their wounds. The laughter had ended, but something more human had begun. By the time a week had passed, the routines of captivity had settled like ash, thin blankets folded at sunrise, formations without order, ration lines drawn in mud. Yet beneath the surface, a gentler war was being waged, one spoonful at a time. Some of the women began to speak quiet confessions in broken English, hesitant German, traded like contraband across the wire. Irma shared how she lost a brother in the Ardennes. Nadine revealed she used to hum lullabies during air raids to keep children from screaming. One night, as frost slicked over the canvas tents, a guard left a tin of cocoa near the mess station. Again, no words. But by morning, the tin was empty, and beside it, a single drawing had been accidentally left done in pencil on the back of a cigarette carton. It showed a tray of food, neatly sketched, and in the corner, a tiny flower. Not a rose, a daisy, simple, growing from a spoon. But not every heart softened. Among the women was Hilda, a former auxiliary known for her sharp tongue and frostbitten stare. She had not touched the food, not once. She stood apart even as others began trading smiles over boiled potatoes and canned peaches. To her, every meal was a performance, a game played by the victors to sap pride from the defeated. "Kindness," she muttered once to Irma, "is just another weapon." She refused to eat, not out of strength, but refusal until the day her legs gave out beside the latrine. The medic called for help, and Marta ran first, kneeling swiftly in the mud. Hildy's lips were blue. She hadn't eaten in 5 days. That night, a tray appeared beside her cot, untouched. But in the dark of early morning, when the sky was a dim bruise above the tents, a faint clatter was heard. Then stillness. The tray was empty. No one spoke of it. But Irma smiled in her sleep. Days turned colder. The air was sharp with the scent of damp canvas and distant smoke, and the routines now carried a strange rhythm, less like imprisonment, more like endurance. One wet afternoon, during a distribution of fresh supplies, a commotion stirred near the mess station. A young guard, barely 20, had offered a piece of cornbread to a prisoner without protocol, eyes locked across the space, frozen. Irma stepped forward, lifted the cornbread slowly, then tore it in two. Half she kept, half she offered back to the guard. He hesitated, then took it, and in that brittle instant, something passed between them, neither apology nor forgiveness, but shared weight. That night, as wind hissed through the camp's edges, a few prisoners began to hum softly, uncertainly. It wasn't a song of their homeland, but something remembered vaguely from the radio, before sirens, before smoke. A lullaby not in language, but in tone. It floated upward, into the cold, and did not come back down. It was during this stretch of quiet songs and shared silences that the Red Cross trucks finally arrived, bearing winter coats and medical supplies. Their bright white insignias looked almost alien against the grayed-out landscape. A nurse with auburn curls, fresh from Geneva, stepped down from the lead truck and paused at the sight. Female German POWs, wrapped in thin blankets, eating beside American soldiers. The absurdity of it struck her less than the humanity. One of the American officers approached with a clipboard, but his voice faltered when one of the prisoners, Nadine, cheeks pink from cold and something else, rose and handed the nurse a folded note. It contained a list, names, ailments, requests for clothing not for themselves, but for patients in the sick tent. The nurse read it twice, then nodded. Across a bruised sky that held the last breath of autumn, it began to snow. Not heavily, just enough. Enough to soften the mud and blur the wire. Enough to quiet everything but memory. But memory, like winter's first snow, settles in layers. Hidden beneath the cautious routines and borrowed warmth were questions none dared voice aloud. What happens when the war outside ends, but inside, the war lingers in the cracks of one's soul? On a morning thick with fog, the women were called outside. A new announcement. Their transfer orders had arrived. Some were headed east, back to zones now governed by Soviet hands. Others, westward, to uncertain fates. The news struck with the steadiness of a falling axe. Armistice had not brought closure, it had scattered it. As the women prepared, folding borrowed garments into found satchels, a quiet fell over the camp. The mess hall served one last meal. Steam rose from trays recognizable now, no longer strange. Marta paused before her final bite. Across from her, Irma squeezed her hand. No words. Just the clink of metal on metal and the echo of quiet things learned in captivity, shame, survival, and the undisguised taste of unexpected grace, a taste they would carry longer than memory itself. Some weeks later, in scattered towns now draped in the wounds of peace, stories of the women's captivity began to surface in whispers. Many never spoke at all. Marta arrived in Hanover, thinner but changed, drawn to silence not from trauma alone, but from a realization that haunted her more than hunger ever could, that kindness could disarm more completely than any weapon. Irma found work in a refugee kitchen, serving meals to children who had never worn a uniform. She never told them where she learned to portion food equally, or why she sometimes stared at a tray longer than needed. Nadine, resettled in a crumbling flat above an old bakery, kept the daisy drawing folded in her coat's lining. Some things were not souvenirs, but anchors. The war had stripped them, reshaped them, but it could not fully erase the quiet, confusing confirmations of their humanity. What stunned them most was not cruelty, but mercy, mercy that arrived in the form of spoonfuls, offered without condition, and that they would never forget. But history rarely closes its pages so neatly. In 1953, at a Red Cross archive near Basel, an American historian named Emil Hartmann stumbled upon a dossier labeled simply Camp Lichtenau, Female Internment, May-October 1945. Inside were rosters, medical records, and 3 faded photographs. One showed a group of women, backs turned, bent over steaming trays. Another revealed a tin of cocoa beside a penciled daisy on cardboard, and the last a blurred image of 2 figures sharing a piece of cornbread across a fence. Hartmann made no footnotes on that photo. He didn't need to. Some truths do not demand narrative. They echo through what is left behind: drawings, silences, forgotten meals. In the aftermath of cataclysm, dignity often returns in whispers, not in grand gestures, but in small transgressions of empathy. Somewhere, in a field no longer mapped, women who had once laughed at enemy food tasted something richer than survival. And though the world moved on, that taste lingered warm, complicated, unforgettable. In the decades that followed, the photograph of the daisy drawn beside the cocoa tin became a silent emblem within certain corners of memory, passed hand to hand among archivists, hidden within exhibits too delicate for headlines. It never made the museums, but it made the rounds. A curator in Dresden once said it reminded her of contradictions that refuse to harden the ways war breaks and builds, the spaces where enemy and human cannot be untangled. Nadine would never see that photo again, but she carried the original sketch until her final days, folded neatly inside a Bible she no longer claimed to believe in. Irma died quietly in 1971, a hospital volunteer to the end. Marta lived longest, the last to remember the laughter at Bad Kreuznach and the stunned silence after. She used to say, with a voice hoarse from age and old weather, "We expected cruelty. We prepared for death. But no one warned us about gentleness." Even now, when the story is recounted, when old records breathe again under careful hands, those unfamiliar with war's underside struggle to believe it. They ask, how could a tray of mashed potatoes and overcooked meatloaf matter in a world gutted by bombs and betrayal? But they miss what the women understood instinctively. The irony was never the meal itself. It was what came with it, the deliberate choice not to degrade, not to retaliate, but to feed. Food, in that camp, became something elemental, somewhere between survival and apology, a shared act, not of forgiveness, but of possibility. There are no statues for such gestures, no medals, just fading sketches, unwritten testimonies, and a few blurred photographs that outlived everyone in them. Somewhere in the corner of history, beyond the timelines and treaties, the laughter at the meals gave way to something deeper, not friendship, not even reconciliation, but a memory powerful enough to outlast hate, one that tasted, quietly, like mercy. And perhaps that is where the true record of history lies, not in battles won or flags raised, but in the hesitant motion of a hand offering warmth to someone told to be an enemy. In the trenches of memory, these women remained unnamed, not because they were forgotten, but because they belonged to no side cleanly, no easy narrative. The cornbread shed, the sugar cubes left without ceremony, the silence that spoke instead of shouted. These were the acts that resisted erasure. War had taught them fear, but captivity taught them contradiction. That not all uniforms define cruelty, not all captors demand hatred. What endured was the unsettling realization that even through barbed wire, humanity could reach across. And in that reaching, in that pause between rejection and revelation, history faltered just long enough to remember what we often choose to forget, that sometimes the most unforgettable victories are the ones where no one loses, and the leftovers are not food, but the taste of compassion itself. For years afterward, in quiet corners of veterans' halls and Red Cross reunions, the story of the Bad Kreuznach women would resurface not as doctrine, but as rumor, like a song half remembered. No one could list all the names. Few dared to define what happened, but some recalled a moment when an officer known for her strictness once paused before a display case of wartime relics. She stared not at maps or medals, but at a single rusted spoon, labeled without fanfare, POW mess kit, 1945. She said nothing, but her knuckles whitened around her purse strap. Decades after the last guard left the wire behind, the absurd truth remained. It was not justice or vengeance that made the strongest impression in that makeshift camp. It was a spoon, a daisy, a meal. Simple things, profound things. And in the quiet spaces between history's louder notes, these became the echoes that endured. Echoes that didn't glorify, didn't accuse, only reminded us what we're capable of when we choose not to hate. In the stillness of a winter many chose to forget, one final artifact surfaced: a scrawled letter, dated January 1946, sent anonymously from Hanover to a Red Cross field office. It held no address, no signature, just a few lines penned in jagged German, translated later by a young aide. They brought food, not fists. I do not understand it, but I did not reject it. I remember the taste. It was not the taste of home. It was the taste of something lost and briefly returned. The letter was never filed, never responded to. Yet it remained tucked into the back of a desk drawer, rediscovered decades later during renovations. The paper had yellowed, the ink had blurred, but the message stayed intact, a final whisper from those no longer counted by nation or cause. In that fragile confession, laced with hunger and awe, the long shadow of Bad Kreuznach lingered, not in facts or figures, but in flavor, in the strange redemption of a war-racked taste. And so the story of Bad Kreuznach breathes on, not bound to film or textbook, but passed through memory like a secret too delicate for the loudness of history. It does not teach victory. It does not glorify captors or absolve the captured. Instead, it shows the quiet terror of grace, the uncanny moment when what one expects least becomes the most revealing of all. The meals that mocked became meals that mattered. The laughter, once cruel, became silent recognition. In the end, there are no monuments to this exchange, no archive box tidy enough to hold it, only the echo of trays clinking, of boots in slush, and mouths stunned into stillness by the warmth of what they had refused. A refusal, then a reckoning. And in the deep fold of time, this remains. Not all wars end with treaties. Some conclude, quietly, in the taste of unexpected humanity, swallowed slowly and remembered forever. Perhaps, in the silence that followed, what lingered most was not the image of the barbed wire or the storm-gray skies, but the small, undramatic gestures that never made it into history books. A slice of bread halved in hesitation, a folded note asking nothing for oneself, a hum barely heard in a moment of stillness. These were not grand acts of reconciliation, but quiet resistances against the dehumanization both sides had endured. The women of Bad Kreuznach did not leave legends behind. They left nuances, contradictions, small truths that defy propaganda. And in the final accounting of war, among the ruins and reckonings, what endured was this: memory softened, not by forgetting, but by tasting again what was once rejected. A warmth in the marrow, a hunger transformed, and the profound, haunting knowledge that even in a world cleaved by violence, a simple meal could remind strangers that they had once all been human. Some say history is made by those who carve it in stone, who raise flags and draft treaties. But the real markers of history often vanish before they're understood. A daisy sketched in pencil, a hand that hesitated before offering food, a woman sitting in silence, finally tasting what she once scorned. These fragments, scattered and unsung, told the story better than any document ever could. They spoke not of defeat or triumph, but of confrontation with the self, with the dissonance between what is taught and what is true. In Bad Kreuznach, war did not disappear. It flickered silently in spoons and glances, in rain-soaked wool and unspoken thanks. The prisoners and their guards never became friends. The fence never came down. But something crossed it nonetheless, something unfashionable, inconvenient, fragile. Humanity, in its most uncelebrated form. And perhaps that is history's final cruelty and blessing, that the moments most worth remembering are the ones least likely to be believed. Years from now, long after uniforms had faded and memories had grown uncertain, a box arrived at the German Historical Institute in Berlin. It bore no return address, only a date and a brittle American stamp. Inside were old documents wrapped around a mess tray, dented and dulled with age. Beneath it rested a single sheet of yellow parchment, bearing 3 words in smudged ink. We tasted peace. No context, no signature, just that. It was placed quietly in the Institute's archives, catalogued without ceremony. Few noticed, fewer still understood. But for those who did, for the archivists who recognized the tray's shape, for the historians who had once chased whispers through dusty records, it was enough. Not a conclusion, not even closure, but affirmation of something once too subtle to grasp. Peace had not arrived with flags or fanfare. It had come quietly, spoon-fed, tasted in disbelief. And though the world seldom remembers such things, tucked beneath the pages of war's thunder, it was there. It mattered. Perhaps that is how it should be remembered, not through statues or salutes, but through the gentle persistence of stories told in hushed tones, between generations too far removed to know the scars firsthand. The women of Bad Kreuznach never returned to the camp. Most disappeared into quiet lives, carrying with them more questions than answers. But in them lived a chapter of war that defied the expected narrative, a chapter where the battlefield gave way to benches and forks, where resistance abandoned its weapons not out of surrender, but out of a deeper reckoning. That even in a world fractured by ideology and dread, something as simple as a shared meal could undermine hatred more profoundly than any ceasefire. In the end, the war left behind altered borders, broken families, rewritten maps. But it also left behind this smaller, quieter truth, that sometimes mercy does not roar. Sometimes it waits, patient and warm, behind a tray of mashed potatoes. So let the names fade, let the uniforms dissolve into dust, let the records remain half complete. What matters is that in a forgotten camp, flooded with mud and memory, something survived the war that no nation could measure an undefended act of care. It wasn't about redemption or reconciliation. It was about the moment defiance waned long enough for hunger and humanity to meet. And in that moment, something ancient stirred, something that our flags and ideologies have long tried to silence: our need to be seen, not as allies or enemies, but as people. The women who once laughed at American rations would never laugh the same way again. Because they didn't just taste a foreign meal, they tasted what it meant to be met with unexpected compassion. That taste, so slight, so quiet, was the beginning of something wordless. And perhaps, in the wreckage of the greatest war humanity had known, that quiet taste was enough, a flicker of peace no treaty ever captured. In the decades that stretched beyond the war's final report, the echoes of Bad Kreuznach remained understated, almost embarrassed by their own endurance. Veterans of every banner passed away, governments closed their files, museums changed their exhibitions, but every so often, a researcher in an archive, a grandchild rummaging through an attic, a teacher retelling a lesser-known story, would stumble upon a drawing, a photograph, a rusted spoon. Nothing revolutionary, nothing grand, just the weight of a moment preserved in metal and memory. What they found wasn't proof of peace, but evidence of something rarer, a pause, a single held breath in the middle of vengeance, a tear not shed, but swallowed, a laugh that ended, and silence that followed. It wasn't war's end, nor its aftermath. It was what lived between the impossible, merciful maybe, and though history will never canonize Bad Kreuznach, its truth endures, quietly, as so few truths do, not in declarations, but in taste bitter, warm, and defiantly human. All wars leave scars, but not all of them bleed. Some take shape as questions, unanswered and unanswerable, echoing in memories traced not by gunfire, but by something quieter, a flavor, an act, a moment of withheld cruelty. The women of Bad Kreuznach are mostly gone now, their laughter long silenced, their names folded into family Bibles and forgotten corners of town registries. Yet what they lived remains, not upon marble or bronze, but in the shared weight of uncertain compassion. They did not walk away as heroes, nor were they ever officially mourned, but through hunger, humiliation, and the slow erosion of hate, they tasted something their armies had never given them, a glimpse of what peace might feel like if neither side insisted on winning. In the end, it wasn't ideology or force that endured. It was the meals, uncelebrated, unrepeatable, unforgettable. Small, human moments, too fragile to last yet lasting still. So if you wish to remember Bad Kreuznach, do not search for plaques or parades. Look instead to the quiet things that remain. A spoon that once carried salvation disguised as stew, a daisy drawn by a prisoner who had long forgotten how to pray, a moment caught not in triumph, but in tremble. These were not the war's epilogue, but its truest mirror, reflecting not what people did in the name of nations, but what they chose despite them. In that faded camp where the laughter of scorn was smothered by the hush of unexpected mercy, something refused to die. It lived on in acts nobody documented, in bites taken after long resistance, in silences shared by those forced to see one another without uniforms. It wasn't peace, it wasn't justice. It was something smaller, and yet infinitely more difficult. It was the truth of what we are, stripped of flags and orders, fragile, starving, capable of grace, and nothing, not time, not silence, not history's indifference can unmake that taste. And so the final taste lingers not loud, not proud, but steady. In old letters and archival corners, it waits not to be celebrated, but to be quietly understood. Not every act of war leaves fire in its wake. Some leave warmth that should never have been possible. Bad Kreuznach was not triumph. It was not reconciliation. It was a glimpse, fleeting and frail, of what happens when the expected cruelty does not come, when mercy arrives unannounced, wrapped in tin trays and silence. Those women, hardened by a world that forgot softness, walked away with something no conqueror could ever design, not peace given, but peace remembered. And perhaps, in that fragile remembrance, lies the deepest truth of war, that in the ash, in the cold, in the degradation, a single taste of shared humanity can echo longer than any victory. No court recorded it. No plaque bears its name. But somewhere between hunger and hope, it happened. And because it happened, it still matters. There is no grand memorial for what they shared, no anthem composed for mashed potatoes and fear, no history textbook that devotes a chapter to women who once laughed and then wept over American stew, yet in the obscurity lies the truth's strange endurance. It survives in the spaces rarely studied, the half-minute pause before a bite, the whispered thanks left untranslated, the eerie calm of a camp softened, not by strategy but by sustenance. Bad Kreuznach will likely remain unmarked on maps of martyrdom or glory, and perhaps that is fitting, because what it offered was not resolution, but reckoning, a quiet contradiction that could not be dressed in medals or measured in archives. In the lost noise of 20th century war, this was a frequency few could hear, the sound of hunger confronted not with punishment, but with nourishment. And in that offering, given without demand, something utterly unregistered in war's vocabulary was briefly, undeniably tasted. Humanity, reduced and restored, one spoonful at a time. In the end, if anyone remembers Bad Kreuznach, it will not be because of battles fought or victories claimed. It will be because somewhere in the aftermath, where cold hands once trembled with anger and dread, they were offered food instead of scorn. A gesture so small it should have vanished in the enormity of war, yet it persisted because survival is not only measured in bodies, but in the moments when hatred cracks, when a tray slides forward across silence, and someone chooses to taste instead of refuse. Those trays, metal, dented and steaming, became time machines for grace. They brought neither amnesty nor absolution, but for a moment they bridged the unbridgeable. And perhaps that's all humanity ever needs to reclaim itself: a single shared meal, a daisy drawn in pencil, a refusal to dehumanize. The women never truly escaped the war, but in that camp, for a breath's length, they were offered something deeper than release. They were offered remembrance, seasoned with mercy, and they took it. The last memory we have is not one forged by noise, but by stillness, a silence heavy, not with emptiness, but with meaning. At an army surplus auction in the early 1990s, a rusted tin tray was purchased for a few coins by a man who thought it might make a good planter in his garden. He noticed, much later, faint scratchings on the underside, 3 initials, and beneath them, the outline of a daisy. He kept it on a shelf, never knowing its full story, only sensing it had held more than food. And across time, across oceans, the daisy bloomed once more, quietly, stubbornly, between the cracks of history's louder chapters. That is how Bad Kreuznach remains with us, unspoken, unclaimed, but enduring. Not because of what was done, but because of what was not. No cruelty, no gloating, just a meal, a moment, and a choice. And in that fragile choice, humanity did not win, it remembered itself, briefly, eternally. And perhaps that is the only legacy worth preserving: the legacy of a daisy etched beneath a tray, of a silence that fed rather than shamed. Bad Kreuznach is not a chapter in textbooks, nor a line in political histories. It is a whisper between generations, a testament not to victory or vengeance, but to restraint. Its story finishes not with a flag, but with a fork, not in the rhetoric of nations, but in the trembling of hands learning not how to fight, but how to offer. If we forget anything, let it not be this, that even in the ash of collapsed ideologies, in the echo of boots and sorrow, a single spoonful of mercy can refuse oblivion. The women laughed once, then they tasted, then they remembered, and in doing so, they gave us something war was never meant to leave behind. Proof, not of what destroyed us, but of what barely miraculously survived. So let Bad Kreuznach slip like mist into the folds of forgotten history, not erased, but absorbed as all truths too subtle for banners eventually must be. Let it remain where it thrived, in the hush between enemy and echo, in the kindness unearthed not by ideology, but by need. Its story will not be retold in parliaments or parades, but it will surface, when least expected, in the gestures that defy cynicism: a meal handed to the hungry, a word withheld in anger, a daisy drawn by a hand once trembling with scorn. And when those moments come, fleeting and unspectacular, they will carry something heavier than doctrine: reminders that even where hate was sown, something fragile and human once took root. A taste not of patriotism, nor penance, but of what survives when everything else is stripped away. The women of Bad Kreuznach did not teach us how to win a war. They showed us, if only briefly, how to end one without forgetting the cost of mercy. Because mercy, once tasted, is never truly forgotten. It lingers not in the triumphant retelling of victories, but in the hushed recollections of those who expected the worst and received something better. Bad Kreuznach will never be a symbol etched in brass or granite, but for a handful of women who once believed they knew their enemies, it became the place where certainty unraveled, where hunger outlasted hate, where laughter at a foreign meal gave way to reverence for what it represented. In that camp lost to fog and footnotes, war gave no closure, but it gave a moment brief, skewed, and painfully human, where someone filled a tray not with punishment, but with food. And in tasting it, those women, who had braced for darkness, instead encountered something luminous, something that asked nothing, promised nothing, yet stayed with them forever. Not a feast, not forgiveness, just a meal. And perhaps, in the quietest corners of history, that is enough. And so we close the lid on a story almost too delicate to survive history's appetite for heroes and horrors. Bad Kreuznach, with its rusted trays and daisy sketches, never demanded to be remembered. It endured simply because it mattered to those who lived it. Not every act of compassion needs a spotlight. Some dwell quietly in the marrow of memory, in the meals that began as mockery and ended as meaning. The survivors did not leave behind legacies carved in stone, but something perhaps more enduring: the shared recognition that dignity, once offered without condition, is never entirely forgotten. Perhaps that is the only conclusion such a story allows: not a lesson, not a claim, but a question left in the stillness. Could the smallest mercy, given at the most unlikely time, be enough to change the shape of remembrance? In Bad Kreuznach, the answer lies not in what was said, or even what was done, but in what was tasted, and never truly untasted again. The story of Bad Kreuznach fades not with a bang, but like steam from a forgotten tray vanishing into the air, yet leaving behind the scent of something once warm. There were no endings carved in valor, only memories sealed in quiet reverence. A daisy under a spoon, a bite taken in silence. The fearful comfort of mashed potatoes, served by hands once labeled as foes. These fragments, scattered and half lost, remain as the war's softest footprints, untraceable, yet irrefutable. They remind us that in the heart of destruction, there is always room for a gesture, a glance, a choice that breaks the pattern. At Bad Kreuznach, war did not end, but for a blink in history's long gaze, it paused long enough to feed, to feel, to remember. And in that pause, beneath rain and ration tins, the most unexpected legacy was born. Not victory, not defeat, but a meal that made mercy taste real. Long gone, never gone, still tasted. The last trace of Bad Kreuznach rests not in libraries or lecture halls, but in the quiet intuition of those who have suffered and still choose to offer grace. Somewhere, in unseen moments of today, when a stranger is fed without question or dignity, is preserved despite old enmities, the echo continues. It is not loud, it does not claim national pride, but it is real. A moment when bitterness is withheld, and something kinder takes its place. The camp is gone now, the women too. But the meal remains a truth not recorded by victors, nor remembered by monuments, only by hearts that wonder what it means to be spared, when the logic of hate says otherwise. That is Bad Kreuznach's true legacy. A story that asks no allegiance, bears no trophy, only lingers when we hunger, not just for sustenance, but for each other's humanity. And long after the last word fades, that taste, against all odds, survives. So ends the taste of Bad Kreuznach, not as a tale of conquest, but as a breath too personal for propaganda. No anthem will be composed for the meals that softened defiance, no textbook mandated to recount the spoon that stilled a heart. And yet, those who once carried hatred like armor tasted something gentler, something bewildering, a daisy pressed into metal, a silence that gave rather than withheld. In the calculus of war, such moments barely register. But to those who lived them, they changed everything. They did not rewrite history, they interrupted it, briefly, radically, and in that interruption, they offered the only remembrance worthy of what war so often forgets, the quiet victory of choosing to see the other as human. This is how Bad Kreuznach persists, not as a chapter, but as a question, left unshouted, left unsimplified, and resting still in the memory of those who dared taste grace where none was promised. You will find no plaque in Bad Kreuznach, no bronze to memorialize the moment when war bent not to force, but to something smaller and more enduring. What remains is passed on like breath between generations, indistinct but vital, a murmur in a family story, a found object on a shelf, a recipe that no one can quite explain. And somewhere, within that slow transmission of memory, the truth lives quietly, that in a camp built for containment, something unexpected escaped. Not the prisoners, not the past, but a lesson so fragile it could only survive through taste. That mercy offered when none is expected is not weakness, it is strength, disguised in warmth and silence. The rusted tray, the daisy etched below, the shared meal that never asked to be believed. These are not artifacts, They are reminders. And in remembering, we keep them alive not to retell war, but to remember what can rise within it. Something lasting, something tasted, and never forgotten. Somewhere between silence and steam, between the memory of barbed wire and the quiet grace of a shared tray, Bad Kreuznach etched its truth not in declarations, but in the soft insistence of human endurance. It was not the food that rewrote their hearts, but the humility within it, simple meals served without mockery, without triumph. The legacy lies not in the rations or the recipes, but in the women who once sneered and then sat, humbled by warmth they had not prepared for, a daisy drawn in fading lines, a spoon once lifted in defiance, then in trembling thanks. The war raged far beyond them, relentless and loud, but in that hushed corner of 1945, beneath the fog and wire, something unfathomably rare was tasted. Not justice, not absolution, just a moment where humanity, dazed and starved, was briefly fed not to forget the war, but to remember what it almost erased. That taste, once swallowed, was never let go, not entirely, not ever.